Well, hey there, guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're making a small parts cutting jig. Well, you've seen me use it many times throughout the build series on the dump truck build, and I thought that before we move on to the trailer, it might be a good idea if we bring the small parts cutting jig here to the show. Now, I did upload some dimensions onto my website. I hope you took advantage of those. But what we're going to do is I'm actually going to make a few modifications. Mine's old, it's tired, and through using it over the years, I found a few things that I'd like to change, but it all starts off with some 3/4 inch thick plywood. Well, this is the old small parts jig, and like I said, it's a little tired. So I have cut some 3/4 inch thick plywood to be able to make a new one. So these here, these 4 pieces, these are the main components that you're going to need. And for me, it's going to be a base. The base is 3 inches wide and it's 21 inches long. We have 2 gussets cut at 45 degrees. I just cut a 2-inch wide strip of the 3/4 plywood. I 45'd each end and then cut it off at 2¼ inches so that it will be upright like this on either end. And this is where the modification comes from our original one. Our original one has a much shorter backboard, and we will still have a shorter backboard, but we need to add a little section because I've thought of a modification that I want to make. So the last piece that we're going to need is this section right here. And this is our backboard. It's 21 inches long, but I have made it 5 inches wide. And this is where we're going to start with our piece. And the first thing we need to do is we need to establish the height of our mounting holes to be able to mount it onto our miter fence. Well, on my miter fence, I have in the aluminum extrusion right here, I have this channel, and this will accept a 1/4 nut in order for me to mount this jig onto the fence. If you have a different style miter fence, you just need to find the mounting point and take your measurements from that. But what we have is we're going to have our base will sit flat on our table saw, and then our backboard will sit on top of our base just like this. So we need the measurement now from the bottom to the center of that utility slot. And in my case, it's 1 1/8. So with this configuration marked, we now need to place 2 holes. We're actually going to do it on this side of the fence here, one somewhere about a third of the way over and one closer to the edge at 1 1/8 up, incorporating the base into it. So we have to subtract the base, but we're going to drill a 1/4 inch diameter through hole, and we're going to counterbore the top of that so that we can get a bolt to sit recessed on our backboard and be able to mount this to our miter fence. Now I've done a 1/2 inch counterbore with a 1/4 inch diameter through hole, and you can see that our 1/4 hardware that we're going to be using, which is just a simple 1/4 bolt, it fits nicely there and recesses so that it's not going to interfere with any of our work that we're putting onto the jig. So with that done, we now want to measure for our slot for our adjustable stop that we're going to place on this side. So from the bottom, we're going to place a line at 7/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge of our backboard. And this will be the location of our slot. Our slot is going to be 5/16 of an inch wide, and we're going to start it at 1 1/4 inch in from the end. So this will be the end of our slot right here. And I think we're going to bring it across to end at, we're going to say 10 inches right there. So from those 2 points, we need a 5/16 wide slot. Now there's a couple ways that you can do it. I'm going to do this at the router table using stops and a 5/16 upcut spiral bit. But if you want, you can drill a 5/16 diameter hole at each end and join the edge lines of your circle using a scroll saw or a hand saw. But for me, the quickest and easiest route to get this done is definitely the router table. Remember, guys, that you don't want to take it all in one pass. You want to do multiple passes, increasing the height of your bit with each pass. And there we go. There's our adjustable stop slot. Now, guys, you may have noticed in that last clip that this is not a new piece of plywood. In fact, this is an old burn board from one of the lasers, which just goes to show that you don't need a lot of like really high quality, high end wood to make a half decent jig. You can recycle if you want, and that's what we've done here. So use what's at your disposal. We now need to move on to finish off our backboard, and this is where the modification comes in. We can see the height here of our backboard that runs on top of our base, and in fact this piece here is 2 inches high, and I want to keep that measurement for the most part. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to draw a line from the bottom all the way across at 2 inches above the bottom edge. And then at 9 inches in from the end with our countersink holes, we're going to place a line here. And it'll be a vertical line. And guys, we're going to need another slot here. The reason for this is I want to put an adjustable hold down here at this point. Now, with my previous jig, I always used scrap wood to hold down the pieces, and it wasn't always as secure as what I would like. So for this one, I would like to have a slot where I can use this light duty hold down. It's a lever action hold down, fairly inexpensive. And I want to place it here on the back in a slot that can allow me to adjust for different thicknesses of material. So we're going to do this a little differently because this will be much smaller hardware. I'm going to gather up my hardware, decide what size slot I want, and then for me, I'm going to drill a hole at the top and the bottom, and then join the edges of those holes, and then finish it off at the scroll saw. I don't think we need a video of that, but I'll show you what I have when I get that done. So with that slot cut, I've attached it on the back with a piece of maple that bridges the slot and bolts that are long enough, a couple washers and a couple of wing nuts, and that will allow my hold down to be adjustable from what I think will be the highest or the thickest piece that I will be cutting and to the lowest piece or the thinnest pieces, and then I can tighten it on the back with the wing nuts and have an adjustable hold down that hopefully will work just fine. So now we just have to modify our backboard to incorporate the lower fence line at 2 inches. So in order to create a transition between this upper part, I don't want this bulk. I want this to come down and give us just the 2-inch section here. So we're going to measure over from our center line of our slot 2 inches on either side. And from that mark, I want to come down on a 45-degree angle and meet up with the wall of our jig down here at our 2 inches. And we'll do the same thing on our other side. But here as well, I don't want these sharp corners. So I want to smooth those out. And I'm not going to get technical here. I'm not going to go crazy. I'm just going to use this lid. I don't even know the radius. I don't really care the radius. I just want to smooth out that transition up here to give a softer area to work with. And we're going to do the same thing here on the bottom. Just like that. And on this side. And at this point, guys, I'm just going to take this to the scroll saw. It's the most comfortable machine for me. You can do this on the bandsaw if you wish, but I'm going to put a number 7 reverse tooth blade in the scroll saw. I'm going to cut along these lines and bring this down to its final. shape and size. Once I get that all cut, we're going to give all of our pieces a good sanding, and then it's time to start our assembly. So I have dry fit this together, and the backboard sits on top of our base. One of the most important things you want to ensure at this point before you carry on is that the base is square to the backboard all the way along, because a jig is only as good as your setup. In other words, if this isn't square, every other cut from here on in that this jig does will not be square. So you want to be really sure of this. So this looks good. I'm happy with it. And what I've done is on the bottom, exactly at halfway in to meet up with the center of the thickness of our backboard, I have placed a couple marks here. One here, one here. This is 6 inches in from the end. And there's another one at 1 inch in from each end, but it's underneath these clamps. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to drill and countersink here for a number 8 screw, probably at least 1.5 inches, I'm going to say, because you don't want to make it too long to interfere with this slot. So let me just check this. You know what? 1.5 inches may be too much. So I think I'm going to go 1.25 inches on the number 8 screws. But we're going to get these drilled and the screws put in place. Once we get that done, we can remove the end clamps and drill the 2 at the end. From there, we can carry on with the assembly. And there we go. Before we go much further on this, we have the base and the backboard screwed together. But just as we checked here for square, we want to make sure that we're still square, and we are perfect there. You also want to make sure that it is square on this edge, because we need this to sit squarely between the table saw surface on this side and the fence of the miter fence on this side. So we'll just check that, and yes, once again, we are perfect. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take those screws out. We're going to put a bead of glue along the back of our backboard and screw this back together. And what we're also going to do is these 90-degree gussets, you want to check them, make sure that they're 90 degrees, because if they're not, they're really going to throw your build off. But we're going to glue these and place them on either end here, just like this, to give us the extra support and be able to keep this at 90 degrees. So I don't think we need a video of the glue up. I'm going to get this all glued up and ready to go, and then I'll show you what we end up with. Well, I haven't glued in the gussets yet. I do have the backer board glued onto the base, but before you glue the gussets in, you just want to make sure that everything is still square. While the glue has not completely set yet, you'll still have the opportunity to break that apart and fix it up if something isn't square. As it turns out, mine is just fine, so I'm going to glue in the gussets. Now, truth be told, on the side where the stock is, another modification I've made is I've cut this little notch in the gusset. And the purpose for that, guys, is sometimes I have a bit longer piece of stock, and I'm kind of limited by the gusset. It gets in my way. So by having that little cutout there, I've allowed it so that a longer piece of stock can extend beyond the gusset to be able to cut over here, and I don't have to cut off sections and make it fit. So let's get these gussets in. Everything's looking great. You can see how well the gussets fit here, how perfectly square that is. And we're going to get these glued in place and let this completely set up. Well, while you're waiting for this to dry, you can make your stop block. And truth be told, I'm going to use the one from my old jig because there's nothing wrong with it. It's barely worn. It's just a block of wood. It's cut square. It's about 1 inch thick, and I've put a threaded insert in it. And that will come down here on the base of your fence, and with a washer and a jig knob, that will just come through the slot that we've made and screw in there securely, just like that. I'll turn it over so you can see it. And there's your stop block. And as long as you're square here, bottom and top, and you take the measurements as to where to drill your hole, it should line up just perfectly. And then you of course, can slide this along to do positive stops for whatever length that you need to cut. So there's that. And at this point now, we can get our hold down put in place again while we're waiting for this to dry. And we'll get our 1/4-20 hardware sat in place at each of our counter bores. So in order to install your fence, you want to back off your 1/4-20 hardware all the way. And as long as you measured carefully, those nuts should align perfectly with your fence and slide into that recess that's here along the front face of your fence. Now, for me, what I want to do, you're going to need to cut the slot in the front of this. So I'm basically going to measure in between the end of our groove here. We want to come over, it looks like, let's say 3/4 of an inch. And we're just going to take a square and draw a line here to the front of our jig. And that is where we want to cut the groove on our fence. So what we're going to do is we're going to slide this along so that it lines up with the center of our blade, our mark there, and we will use a Robertson screwdriver or whatever your 1/4-20 hardware takes, and we will tighten this in place on your fence. And now that is solidly there. I also like to take my stop from my fence and place at the one end, and this just helps to prevent it from moving. So at this point now, it's time to cut the slot that's going to be in our small parts jig. So we're just going to raise our table saw blade up until it's a fair bit above the base, and we're just going to follow through with the cut. So how do you use the jig? Well, for me, I've got some 1/8 inch thick material here, and you can see here where this notch that I put in is really going to help, because now I can actually get it out beyond the edges of the fence. But let's say that you want to make some 1/2 inch strips out of this. So I have some setup blocks. I have a 1/2 inch and I have a 1, 2, 3 block. Now for me, I like to leave as much room between the setup block and the blade as I possibly can. So in this case, I'm actually going to use a 3-inch gap there. So we're going to tighten it up. I have 3.5 inches. We're going to take away that 1/2 inch spacer. We're going to move our piece over to touch our 3-inch block. And then with this lockdown here, or hold down, we're going to lock that in place and then take away our 1, 2, 3 block. Now we don't need that blade raised to that full height, so we're going to lower it, and then you can just carefully follow through with the cut. And check that out. There is a 1/2 inch piece cut perfectly safely. My fingers were never ever near the blade. You need another one. Put your 3-inch block there, lift up your hold down, move your stock over until it touches the 3-inch block, lock it down, remove the 1, 2, 3 block, and follow through again with the cut. And it's as simple as that. There's a second one cut. There's now 2, and they are identical. They are both 1/2 inch. They are exactly what I want, and my fingers were never, ever, ever in any kind of danger. Guys, it's a spectacular jig. And if for some reason you're cutting stock that is thinner, that will not allow this hold down to touch it. There's nothing wrong with using a wider piece of stock to be able to pin it and lock it in place. My previous method was to hold a piece of stock down. If this 1, 2, 3 block was the scrap stock, I would hold this like this and hold it down, but I just found there's too much shifting and there's still the opportunity for my fingers to be exposed. Guys, this is a much better way to go, and honestly, it's a spectacular jig. And there you have it, a small parts cutting jig. Guys, you have seen me use this jig multiple times on the channel in various forms and various builds. Most recently with the model build that we just completed, or part of it that we completed. So it's very fitting to bring this jig to you because I've had so many requests as to what's going on with this jig, where'd you get the jig, how do you make it, etc., etc. And I had so many requests that I actually put the dimensions for it on my website, and that is for the old version. And then when I decided to bring it here to the show, I decided that I was going to make the modifications that after years of using the old design, I thought it could really use. One of them being that exit hole out the left side of the fence for longer material. The other thing being that upper section that has the adjustable hold down. That is quite possibly one of the best modifications to this entire jig. It makes it so much safer. The other one was safe as well because I never held the stock with just my fingers unless it was extremely long stock. But this makes it so that you don't have to hold it at all with your fingers. Guys, this will even work for cutting dowels, and all you really need is to be able to get a piece that hold down can wedge the dowel into the corner of the jig, and then you can cut as many dowels to the length that you wish. The main thing to remember, whether it be this simple jig or whether it be any jig, is that the jig is useless unless it's square. And it can't be kind of square. It has to be perfect. So take your time. Make sure that before you make your cuts that your table saw blade is exactly 90 degrees to your table. That's going to help you do the assembly and get everything perfectly square. Make sure that your miter fence, as you're cutting, say, the gussets, is exactly square. That if you set that thing to 90 degrees or to 45, that it's actually cutting a 90 degree or a 45. Because let's face it, a miter fence is nothing but a fancy industrial or commercially available jig. That's all it is. It is a device that allows you to cut repeatable angles. And that's what a jig is essentially. It's something that allows you to repeat a process with accuracy over and over and over again without having to go through a lot of setup. So essentially, a miter fence is nothing more than a fancy jig. And if that miter fence is out just a little bit, it's no better than a jig that's poorly made, because now every cut that you make is going to be off square, or the degrees are going to be wrong, or what have you. So make sure that you set up your jigs well, make sure that your equipment is tuned up, make sure that when you're making this jig, you're checking it for square. And as long as you keep all of those things in mind, this is an amazing project, and it'll go a long way to helping you cut smaller parts safely so that you can keep these for another day of woodworking. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I want to thank all of you that have messaged me and asked me about this jig because it pushed me to be able to make a new one and make an improved version, which indirectly, or however you want to say it, it made my shop safer and made it so that I was working safer, because now I don't have to hold things anymore. Guys, I'm going to put the links down below to those hold downs. They're really inexpensive. They are a light duty hold down. You're not going to hold 2x4s with them by any means, but that's all you want with this is a light duty. So I'm going to put the links to those down below. I hope you're going to check those out, and I hope you're going to make this jig for yourself. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We have an amazing audience base here, guys. I'm hoping that you're going to consider becoming a part of that. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the content. I hope you've learned something today and maybe taken something positive away from the show. I hope you're going to give this one a try for yourself and make your own small parts cutting jig. And more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.